Orion Alliance opens borders, for diplomatic missions only. It was a rather lurid headline for what was ultimately a rather uneventful article. After all, it was unlikely that anyone really expected the group that had formed around humanity to fully cut itself off from the rest of the galaxy. Still, the sensation-hungry news media couldn't help itself but make it seem like it was a huge turning point in the ongoing conflict after some weeks of uncertainty, when in reality, it would likely merely be remembered as the point when it actually started. Apogenerara Ordoxia Tua, the High Matriarch of the Zadaitos, and currently acting Leader Supreme of the Great Community Station, was quick to acknowledge and ultimately brush aside this new development for the moment. There would be a time to make diplomatic contacts with humanity as a whole, but that time was most certainly not right now. There was, however, someone who found themselves rather intrigued by this rather predictable turn of events. "Looks like we aren't completely exiled just yet," the excited chitter of a small primate erupted throughout her office, as Alexander Page loudly commented on the article's content from the space in front of the Leader Supreme's work desk. The human's bright eyes were opened wide as he stared upwards at the much taller Zadaitos' face. To Tua, it looked like there were nothing but even paler dots in his pale face, reflecting the lights coming from above back at her in little sparkles. He also had that strange human habit of baring his teeth while excited as he spoke, an image that harshly crashed with the primate's otherwise quite pleasing appearance. But to be fair, so did the parts of bright cloth he tended to drape himself in accordance to his people's traditions, something that he vehemently insisted on, despite his usually quite forthcoming worldview. In addition, he always wore a necklace with a strange symbol that was so small that Tua had a hard time making it out. "The closing of the borders never extended to humans in the first place, so nothing has changed for you," Tua reminded the constant high-energy man, with a distracted glance down at him, while the two halves of her split trunk were busy finishing up some orders, and signing off on some of the non-urgent documents that had piled up during her absence from the station. "And since I'm sure you are aware of that, I expect that this isn't the only reason that you're harassing me outside of our scheduled meetings." The light-haired human stroked his hair away from his face in a coy movement that was quite reminiscent of his now one-armed conspecific. A rare event because despite their shared genetic heritage, Alexander's behaviour usually differed greatly from that of James, which he immediately proved when he then started to walk around the High Matriarch's desk to approach her directly. Only that he walked less and jumped more. With little regards of how he came across, the primate used all of his Deathworld-given strength with each step he took, basically leaping around and crossing the, for him, quite large room quickly and with minimal effort. A far cry from the calm way James tended to conduct himself, even in standard gravity. Tua had to tilt her head to the side so at least one of her many eyes could see the tiny man when he walked up to her side with his head thrown all the way back into his neck so he could stare straight up. "Of course not, Your Highness," he assured her, accompanied by a conciliatory gesture of his hands, "but this likely means that they'll be sending people out again, and with that they might be sending people here as well, if not for any serious talks, then at least to snoop around to try and find dirt on you, and I think we should discuss how we're dealing with that. You're not going to turn them away, after all, are you?" Tua paused for a moment and laboriously took some steps back so she could turn towards her company, without the threat of accidentally trampling him in the process. The man, who was a mere speck at her side when viewed in comparison, showed no fear of her, even whenever her massive legs came down quite close to his body. "Like everyone, they will be wholeheartedly welcomed to the Great Community Station. I will not allow any less under my leadership," she replied sweetly, and made a dismissive wave with one end of her trunk. "The ultimate goal has always been to earn them as allies, not to keep them as enemies. While right now that might be out of reach, I see no reason in pushing them away even further. If they want to look around, let them. The station is a sight to behold after all, and it might even help clean up the slander that is being spread around among your people." She was careful with her words. Even though Alexander usually behaved like any and all accusations against her were already proven fact, she never so much as acknowledged that behaviour, and made sure to remain very particular in the statements that came out of her mouth. Alexander chuckled his energetic chuckle. "It may not be quite as out of reach as you imagine. They are playing a dangerous game with our dear ambassador, after all," he said, and shrugged with a single arm, in a way that seemed almost like he was mocking James. "But you're right. Shouldn't flounder our chances before they even come up, although we shouldn't take this lightly either. Wouldn't put it past some military gumshoes to miraculously dig something up. They always find something." Although he remained mostly chipper during his explanations, there was a hint of bitterness creeping underneath his voice during that last part. Possibly some estrangement that happened between him and the human establishment at some point. It would help explain some of his recent actions. After all, he had voluntarily offered up his assistance in seemingly helping to work against the current interests of the leadership of his species. And while the High Matriarch, of course, would have loved to merely chalk this up to him and the people supporting him, seeing the reason behind her cause more so than the rest of their species did, which certainly was also the case, that could hardly be the sole reason for his actions, given the lengths he had seemingly been willing to go to in order to reach their current agreement. She was still cautious of the man, even if he had so far managed to present himself as a quite dedicated ally. He had, for example, filled her in on the little trick with the so-called Morse code James had used to smuggle a message out to humanity underneath her trunk. "You sound quite confident in being able to sway your people's opinions," she commented, not wishing to probe his allegiances at such an uncontrolled moment in time. "And while I appreciate the enthusiasm, by all accounts it seems that you are pretty alone in that opinion among your peers, especially given the amount of faith many seem to put into Ambassador Aldwin. Do you really think your word will be able to hold more weight than his?" She expected him to laugh again and give some sort of ridiculing answer connecting to her concern. However, that did not happen. Instead, his face turned from one of played-up amusement to one of confidence, as his features hardened, and his so far wide-open eyes relaxed slightly. He combed his hair back with his hands once again, and took a quick breath in the process. "James Aldwin," he said, with a strong voice carrying just the slightest hint of animosity with it, "is a small fish in a big pond. Sure, he's got his big story and some powerful people backing him up, but, like any poster boy, he's lacking depth. And once the first bit of razzmatazz has died down, the image will start to come apart. My people have a long history, and there's a lot you can learn from it if you know how to look." Quite the fancy way with words, which left the question if he was just talking a lot or actually saying much. His story of being this fighter for rights and freedom is going to be hard to keep up when it's the literal military backing him. They don't have the best track record. He continued his explanation, unperturbed. "While it is a powerful sponsor, it leaves many questions. As a soldier, is he following orders? Which orders are those? Does he really say what he's thinking, or is it all just what the government wants him to say? What stake do they have in this? They forcefully extracted him after he started supporting you in a way that is rather unpopular amongst them. And, right after, he suddenly started promoting the exact opposite for them instead. Is he just a puppet that says whatever he is told? It allowed them to close the border without much deliberation or backlash, after all, which had a huge influence on trade and economy. Even started a war with one of our neighbours. What other things might they be able to quickly push as soon as Aldwin says something new? And how will they react if someone goes against that?" With last steps, the primate started the march left and right, tapping his fingers of one hand into the palm of the other rhythmically as he spoke. And that's not even mentioning the man himself. He finished up his long-winded explanations of his thought process regarding his people. Aldwin is far from a blank slate, even if we ignore the misconduct of his past, which will likely be chalked up to useful ignorance. He was always quite vocal about his personal beliefs, just like he is today, and therefore there is an extensive record of anything he thinks about all kinds of topics, available for anyone who is willing to look. And with that will come people who disagree with the things he said. In short, people have plenty of reasons to doubt Aldwin, and now that the controversial figures have basically stepped down, it's just a matter of not giving people any more reason to doubt us." He finalised his point by coming to a stop right in front of Tur with his arms outstretched, likely representing the wide range of possibilities they had, his lips slightly twisting to a smirk, this time without showing off his fangs. Tur lowered herself onto her front knees, which caused her large tusks to frame Alexander in the space in between them as they neared the floor, when she lowered her head with her long neck. Her head's shadow was enough to dwarf the man underneath it, and for the first time since their conversation had started, it seemed that the human had some second thoughts about his attitude towards her. It wasn't fear like she used to see in the eyes of James. It was a mere and unbridled uncertainty. Now that she was this close, she could see his pale blue eyes dart left to right in a jittering motion, as he couldn't decide which of her eyes he should look at as he stared up at her. His hand clutched the symbol in front of his chest. She lowered her trunk, encircling Alexander with his two ends, cutting down his personal space even more, without ever actually invading into it. Her sheer size made her seem a lot closer to him than she actually was. "Why would they ever doubt us, Alexander?" she asked in a most empathetic voice,
We've only ever had their best in mind. Although if you are right, maybe there are indeed people who do not want them to see. And in that case, they'll need to be shown.
Alexander audibly cleared his throat and somewhat regained his composure.
We'll still need to wait, he said, and slowly let go of the symbol again, although he wasn't quite back to the level of absolute confidence he was exuding before. It's still too fresh. The excitement has to fade before people will be willing to listen. Tua paused in her current position for just a second longer. Then she started to push herself up, returning to a full, enormous height, while briefly brushing across the man's chest with one end of her trunk at the same time.
Indeed, she confirmed his assessment, shaking out her neck after it had gotten slightly strained from her holding it bent down like that, which made her ears flutter around slackly.
In the meantime, we'll entertain our guests and make sure that everyone knows exactly where we stand, no matter what anyone says. And with Earth being out of the question for the time being, maybe we can think of a good place to start.
Far out in a completely different part of the galaxy, a certain expedition ship was meandering in the void of space, just outside of the galactic plane a short time later, still close enough to the core to remain in communication range. The clock had recently sprung from one day to the next, and so a fresh set of crew members stood at attention on the bridge, waiting for the captain to finish his greeting as he welcomed them to the start of their shift. Many of them, while remaining respectful, eyed him with an air of suspicion and curiosity, ranging from outright distrust to a more sorrowful nature. After all, it was a secret to no one what accusations were made against him, and what that meant for their work under his command. More precisely, how they would be under his command much longer. Once he finished the addressing of his crew, Captain Uton paused briefly to allow them to speak, and despite any second thoughts they might have had, everyone in the line still replied with a loud and well-practiced, "Sir, yes sir!" Then he dismissed them to their work, leaving them to hurry around, either to their station or to find their supervisor to get their duties for the day. Meanwhile, the captain slowly returned to his seat, sinking down into it with a slow groan, while shifting his shoulders and back around. For a moment, his eyes visibly found the purple, reflective form of Dio Nalzam, who walked away from him in a swift manner. Her unmoving exterior gave no indication as to whether she had noticed or not, but with her all-around vision it was hard to imagine she hadn't at least caught a glimpse. Either way, she did not acknowledge his attention, and quickly made her way around the bridge, the glint of her exoskeleton becoming one of the many lights shining all around. Each step sounding out with a loud clack. Warrant Officer Reprieg approached the captain's seat, his head cranked upwards to look at the spot he had last made out the division officer's form, before she managed to slip away from his view, somewhere on the other side of the bridge, almost right above his head. "Something I've missed, sir?" the Sipperslang asked interestedly, heaving his weight forwards with the help of his crutch almost effortlessly, and nodding his head in the direction the captain's gaze had been stuck in. The captain turned his head, his wide eyes looking at Reprieg in surprise for a second, before his face shifted into a placid one with relaxed eyes and lips, his narrow nostrils slightly flaring. "Oh no, it's nothing," he said, and his large hand reached for his face, rubbing across his mouth and pinching his lips in between two fingers for a second, before letting go and making them snap back against his teeth with a soft smack. Then, seeing how Reprieg had stooped in front of him and stood at attention, he added, "Oh, and at ease. Don't strain your leg on my account." Reprieg exhaled through his trunk audibly and shifted his weight, leaning fully onto his crutch with both arms crossed on top of it, while moving the stump that remained of his second leg back and forth. "Well, if you say so, sir," he said. "Anyway, I'm not used to working on the bridge yet, but it drags down morale if the captain is looking this pensive." Uton chuckled hesitantly, scratching at his face with the tips of his dark fingers. "Allow an old man a bit of pensiveness at the end of his career," he gestured with a tired look in his dark eyes. "Morale will improve as soon as my replacement arrives. I just have to finish this last tour first." He had to finish this last tour? What, was this a chore? It was a miracle that he hadn't been suspended immediately. Reprieg had no idea about the kinds of strings that had been pulled behind the scenes. The fact that he got to finish this tour was a privilege to say the least. But that fact didn't change the wariness that the captain exuded, when he lifted his gaze again. "But even at my age, I know that you're not just here to comment on my demeanor," the large primate added to his previous statement, and leaned onto one of the armrests of his seat. "So, what can I help you with, Warrant Officer?" Reprieg wriggled his trunk in amusement and nodded his head. "Have you read the latest batch of orders we received?" he asked, with an interested tilt of his head, and the captain immediately chuckled again.
I'm afraid that is something I can specifically not help you with, he replied amusedly. I'm afraid my authority doesn't reach that far. And even if I wanted to come along, I'm afraid gravity poses a far greater obstacle for me than for you. The less you're built for, the less you can handle above your pay grade as well. Something about exponential forces, or so I hear.
Reprieve shook his head. Not a problem. Leave the Deathworld to the Deathworlder, he said. Although he was not looking forward to enjoying a planet with an even higher gravity than his homeworld for a while, even if he physically could. But, well, I wanted to thank you personally. Granting a request like mine cannot have been easy, given your current position. Slightly bashfully, he swiped across the floor with the tip of his towel and rotated his shoulders a bit. He had no idea how the captain had managed to do it, but somehow he had been able to convince the Leader Supreme to allow him to employ a certain other young Deathworlder on his ship, despite the risks this could pose. He and the High Matriarch had a very long history together, and she trusted his judgment. Something like this would never have been possible at Reprieve's request. Uton pursed his lips and slightly narrowed his eyes with a gleam.
Oh, on the contrary. Now that I'm at the end of the line, I have to worry very little about making any possible controversial decisions. Least I could do after the unfortunate circumstances we suffered back in the GCS, he boasted, and leaned back a bit more while breaking eye contact with Reprieve. Besides, it's not like I'm known for employing the occasional unusual figure under my care. It's just a shame that I won't be around to watch her for long.
His gaze turned wistful, as the lights on the screens above and around them reflected in his eyes. Controversial figures indeed. A strange twist of fate that Okamaoni Station would yet again be the place where such a figure would board the captain's ship. Surely he was thinking of his former protege just now. Suddenly, this was getting uncomfortable. Well, I should probably, Reprieve started. However, he didn't get far into his sentence before he was interrupted by the captain.
You're a good man, Reprieve,
the primate said, his face suddenly turning towards Reprieve with a serious expression, while his meaty fingers lightly tapped in his armrest.
I can tell you're not the same person that first stepped on board of my ship some months ago. If I can be so blunt, back then I would have liked to smack you across the head whenever you opened your mouth. But now you're a good man. Try to do a good job as well, alright?
Reprieve hesitated for a moment, still frozen in the motion of his previous statement. Slowly, he managed to break out of his stupor, with his gradually forming his reply. Alright, he more questioned than answered, and lifted his trunk in the captain's direction as an instinctual attempt to get an elaboration out of him.
The people of Dunima are against a disbanding of the council. I don't know why, but they were, Uton explained,
sitting up straighter and folding his hands in front of his body.
If you do a good job there, then maybe...
He stopped there and seemed to look for a way to finish that sentence. However, Reprieve removed one of his hands from his crutch to gesture his understanding. He didn't need to hear any more than that. The man was still hoping against hope. Reprieve didn't share his optimism, but then again, he was the one being sent to the planet filled with monsters, so who was he to judge? I'll do a better job than last time, that much is certain, sir, he assured the man, feeling that wasn't promising too much. He certainly intended to follow up on it. After all, he wasn't keen on losing another limb. But now I should really get to work, sir. Sorry for keeping you for so long. Uton nodded his large head, his lips curling into a hopeful and satisfied expression as he replied,
Steady on!
After a shift of rather uneventful general bridge work, Reprieve stepped through a heavy door into the large and busy Herbivore Casino. As always, there were long lines in front of nearly every counter, and pretty much every table was at least partially occupied, with large crew members crowding around them while smaller people sat on top and used the large bumps on the place as their own table substitutes. For a moment, Reprieve looked around to see if he could find any familiar face, before deciding that the currently only person his size on board that needed a wooden crutch to walk would be far easier to spot than anybody else. Therefore, he just went over towards the line and grabbed one of the small trays, which he carried by wedging it between his body and his free arm, since he needed the other one to walk. More and more often, it ironically felt more like he had lost an arm rather than a leg, when it came to his overall way of life. Once it was his turn at the counter, he stocked up on some basic greens as well as some protein-heavy roots, all finely fried with some nice spices, before turning in the direction of the tables once again. And as he had expected, like an apparition, Viridity had appeared standing in front of him, looking down at him with her radiant blue eyes. I wish I could still sneak around like that, Reprieve joked with a nod in her direction, taking a few loudly clacking steps towards her. Viridity wasn't quick to reply to that, looking back at him with some concern in her gaze instead.
However, after Rapri gave her an encouraging glance over his shoulder, she seemed to relax somewhat. "Maybe we'll need to get you one of those things people put under chairs," the ivory pillar of a woman replied, her amused voice a melodious plucking of strings. "You know the ones?" Rapri scoffed. "Maybe that's an idea," he said, while allowing her to lead him through the room to wherever she had already started her meal before coming to pick him up. As they moved through the crowded room, just like it had been with the captain, the occasional distrustful or suspicious glance was thrown at them, although their faces were admittedly recognized far less than overall. It was easy enough to ignore them. Soon enough, Rapri spotted a familiar purple-hued wall of feathers, standing tall in front of a table. "Hey there, rookie," he greeted the large avian, extending his trunk and lifting his tail up, since those were quite literally the only appendages that he had available. The avian turned his head, so one of his large eyes fell onto Rapri, and his pupil constricted noticeably. "Hello," he replied, his head shaking ever so slightly, which made some of his plumage stand up. Walking up to the table, Rapri placed his tray on top of the table's plate that was about on eye level with him. "You need any help with that?" Viridity asked from behind him, and strode across his back with one of her slender, prehensile limbs. No, I've got it," he replied, thanking her with a nod before putting his now free hand onto the table, so he could easily keep his balance, as he now also put his crutch on top of it. Then, with both hands, he could put himself onto it easy enough. As soon as he was up on the plate, he used his leg to scoot over towards the middle of it, pulling his tray and crutch along with him. "So, you seen the new orders?" Desil nodded, while Viridity walked around the table to get back to our own tray. "Dunima," he mumbled through his beak, while rolling some sort of nut around with his tongue. "Not my first choice personally. I hear it's pretty deadly there." "There's a station close to standard hovering around the system," Viridity helpfully informed him, and grabbed a juicy-looking berry off of her tray. "Also, some smaller colonies and some low-gravity planets. Since we're not usually in the business of suicide missions, I suggest that everyone who can't handle the Deathworld gravity should probably stay on any one of those options. Most of the leading class isn't planet-side anymore anyway. They took their chance and got off the Deathworld while they still could." On the other side of the table, Desil scoffed. "Sounds like a great leadership right there," he commented. "You got that right," Viridity agreed, with a concert of her giggling erupting, right before she stuffed the berries somewhere under the mask that was her face, where she made quick work of it with a juicy squishing noise. Rapri stretched his neck for a second, and then looked down at his own food. He was hungry, but he didn't want to start eating before getting at least one thing out of his system. "Well, those are exactly the people we're going to have to work with, aren't they?" he asked, finally picking up his fork, and taking a first stab at the fried mixture of greens and roots. You win some, you lose some," Viridity said. "We'll take those that work with us over the ones that don't, and once we've gotten some sense into the Miat, they might just become better at picking their leaders in the future." She added something else that Rapri couldn't quite hear, because the crunchy sound of his own chewing deafened him for a moment. However, the first thing he heard once he could again was Desil's reply of, "Well, maybe they can't convince anyone else, but they might just be able to convince the humans, who then can convince everyone else. Like telling a girl's friend that you find her pretty instead of telling her directly for added effect. I heard that sometimes works." "Does it now?" Viridity immediately jumped on that, the brightest spots in her eyes narrowing in amusement. Desil shook his head again, puffing up the feathers on his face even more. "No idea, you tell me," he replied, rather unfazed by her insinuation. And, as if she hadn't even considered what he had said before trying to tease him with it, the ivory giant paused for a moment, and ruminatively scratched across the natural mask of her face with some of her flexible arms. "It may," she finally admitted after some seconds of pondering, "although it still depends who it comes from." Rapri sighed amusedly. "Are you two done with flirting then? Because I don't feel like taking part in that," he said. As soon as he had said it, it seemed that Desil needed to swallow heavily. He didn't react any further than that, but it seemed that something was bothering him. But if it came up during this topic, it was probably private enough that Rapri did not want to ask. "Well, this sort of work would be a nice change of pace at least," the avian mumbled after a bit. "Something you want to tell people about, you know? Always in comm range, always available. Might not be the nicest place, but at least it has network connection at all times." Rapri nodded. "True," he said, "and it's work I can do with this no problem." He tapped onto what was left of his thigh loudly to indicate what he was talking about. A contemplative scale erupted from Viridity's vocal cords, and some of her arms reached across the table to carefully inspect his currently discarded crutch. Won't there be a problem in case you really do have to go planetside? She asked, and briefly lifted the locomotion aid off the table to weigh it in her graspers. Raprik laughed and quickly snatched the crutch out of her hand. As long as this doesn't break under me, I'll be fine, he said, waggling the crutch around as if it was a plaything. Then, with a long exhale, he got a little more serious, pushing the walking aid down on top of his thighs. Won't exactly be easy, but I'll manage. Not like getting around in gravity like that is ever easy. Dasil rustled his feathers with a shake of his entire body. Well, for some it is, he remarked, while still looking slightly pushy from the air stuck within his plumage. We know a few people who'd have no problem with it. I was exaggerating, Raprik exclaimed, throwing his hands up in defeat. We know multiple entire populations of people who have no problem with it. We're talking about visiting one of them right now. Yes, and personally I'm glad none of the people we know personally will be involved with it this time, Hiverty mentioned in an upset tone. Raprik snickered. Don't push your luck, he warned her jestingly, and pointed at her with the tip of his fork. Remember, both humans and Miet believe in the idea of speaking things into existence. Dasil made some sort of throaty, cooing vocalization. And since when are you superstitious? He asked, seeing as that had gotten Raprik's attention. Raprik snickered once again. I'm not, he said with an amused tone. But if humans believe it, there might actually be something to it. At that, both Dasil and Hiverty tilted their heads, with their pupils narrowing down on him, 2 black and 2 white ones. You are putting your faith in the humans? Hiverty asked with emphasis, bringing Dasil to the punch with amusement creeping into her voice that sounded like he was very close to a giggle in the way it was plucking. Raprik scoffed and threw his head back so he could shake out his trunk. Faith? Don't be ridiculous, he replied, and his voice matched Hiverty's tone. I just realized that, if people who seem to survive everything are wary of something, it might be worth being wary of. Just in case. Remember to pack everything. The flight is rather long, Elmo Krieger said from where she stood in the doorframe, conspicuously holding a large carry bag in her hand without ever acknowledging its existence. If James could have thrown her out, he would have loved to, but this was her ship, and in this case he even refrained from turning her off. After all, for once, there was something that he wanted from her for a change. So he was, or at least pretended to be, a good boy, and dutifully replied, Yes, ma'am. I have a detailed list to make sure we are missing nothing. Said list was currently in Sheeta's hand, since she was rummaging through a box of hygiene supplies, making sure that everything was present and accounted for in the correct amounts that would allow them to comfortably get through the voyage, and even have some extra in the end. Most important will be that we take along plenty of plant produce. No idea how much Dunamur imports, but I'd rather not be reliant on that for my health. Wouldn't want to be the first case of scurvy recorded in ages, James informed his mother, half joking, half serious. The Emerald gave him a courtesy smile. Our nutritionist will make sure you have everything you need, she assured him, and suddenly started to take some strides into the room. She took a look at the folded pieces of uniforms that were neatly placed in stacks next to large suitcases, and simply counted them in her head. She also walked along one of the dressers the piece of clothing had previously been stored in, gliding a finger over its surface, and then looking at its tip as if she was checking for dust. Seeing the result, she raised her eyebrows in surprise and smirked, while as she commented, Wow, you even wiped the dust. You must really be up to something today. Well, she didn't know him as well as he did her. Maybe he did make it a bit too easy. But since she had already figured him out, he decided to get out with it in the nicest way he could. About that possible excursion to the Norsa Maune station, ma'am. That's not up to me, James. She immediately tried to shoot him down, or maybe inform him, he wasn't quite sure. Decisions like that are made by the people even higher up than me. You've gotten your orders directly from the top this time, after all. Not exactly something I can interfere with. James cleared his throat and raised his hands defensively, and conspiratorially at the same time. Yes, I know, but I'm not the only one going, after all, he said. To which his mother turned towards him in what seemed like genuine surprise, as her eyes widened and her mouth curled almost bemusedly. Well, if you get the permission, or maybe even order to go, I'm not going to forbid your escort from following you there, she said matter-of-factly, and James could tell that she just about managed to make fun of him during that statement. But again, that is not up to me. Usually a reason to celebrate. However, while Representative Kumar had so far not given James a reason to specifically dislike him, he also had much less of a connection to him, positive or not, which would make it much harder to find a way to convince him of things like this excursion. Oh well, nothing he could do about it. In the meantime, She'd seemed to have finished the inspection of the box after having carefully placed everything back inside, while reconfirming with the list that it was still the correct amount. "All checked and packed. It seems that everything is in order," she informed him in English. A little rough around the edges, but overall not incorrect. He wasn't sure if she was just practicing or if she wanted to show off to the Admiral that she had actually done her required task of learning the lingua franca used by humanity. And at least in James's opinion, it was pretty impressive how much she had managed to get down in such a short amount of time. He had learned English since 3rd grade, and it had still taken him much longer to get anywhere near the level she was now back then. The Admiral nodded in a restrained satisfaction and walked up to the middle of the room where she finally set down the bag she had so far been taking for a walk, for no good reason. "It seems you've got everything handled," she said, immediately strutting towards the exit as soon as the bag had hit the ground. "Try these out as well. We had them custom ordered a while ago, and your escort will be wearing them, so they might be useful in case you want to go incognito." "Thank you, ma'am," James and Sheeta both replied, with varying amounts of confusion in their voices, while they watched her disappear into the hall. Then, their gazes synchronously fell onto the bag. Shortly after, they were sitting on the floor, facing each other with the bag emptied in between them. Inside had been 2 helmet-like devices that seemed rather familiar in their general shape. Breath filters? James thought confusedly, and took one of the things into his hands. In what way are these custom ordered? It was true that he would need a new one for the mission, and it couldn't hurt if Sheeta had one as well, but what's so special about these things? "That was surprisingly calm for the 2 of you being in one place," Sheeta suddenly commented, after having grabbed the second filter and also inspecting it in her hands, with a curiously narrowed gaze. "We're not always at each other's throats," James replied, turning his filter around to pull it over his head. It took some pushing and twisting, but finally, it sat snugly around his face and the world got a bit darker through the tinted visor of the thing. As soon as it detected being worn, it automatically turned on, and slightly hummed as it filtered the breaths he took, and amplified his voice when he made a sound, just like any other modern breath filter would. So far, he could not make out anything special about it. We had been known to coexist peacefully for short amounts of time. When he looked up again, Sheeta put her own filter down onto her lap, and looked at him like she was trying hard to hold back laughter, much to James's surprise. "Did I say something funny?" he asked, tilting his head to the side to signal his confusion despite his face being obscured. Sheeta shook her head, her moving tail still giving away her amusement. "No," she said, "it's just... Wait, let me show you." And with that, she also pulled over the filter. And although she had some trouble with her large ears, it seemingly fit pretty well in the end. At first, everything seemed normal. However, as soon as it started to activate, something strange happened. A face happened. Not an actual face, of course, but a facsimile. Something akin to a smiley, just a bit more detailed. The kind of face toy robots made for children would have on their displays. And from the looks of it, it seemed to mimic the movements of Sheeta's face under the mask. The eyes moved when he expected hers to move, and the mouth shifted as she giggled. James expected the same thing was happening on his visor right now, although from inside the mask, it was extremely hard to notice it. "You see now?" she asked, with clear amusement in her voice, and the lip flaps of the mask matched her words near perfectly. The movement was surprisingly smooth and clean. "Yeah," James replied, and chuckled right back at her. Well, at least people would be able to read their expressions now.